Hi again. Our speaker today has been called the Indiana Jones of the Sea. His name is Ross Richardson, and he's spent the last decade searching for and documenting shipwrecks off the coast of West Michigan. He's worked with Great Lakes shipwreck explorer David Trotter, Clive Cussler's NUMA team, and was on the board of directors of the Michigan Shipwreck Research Associates for nearly a decade. Today, Ross will tell us about a particular ship that went down near Sleeping Bear Dunes in 1854. Soon after the ship, the Westmoreland, sank, killing half of her crew and passengers. A long search began for the ship's remains, which were rumored to hold $10,000 worth of gold coins and 280 barrels of whiskey. Ross has extensively researched the legend, the history, and his predecessor's search efforts to discover the Westmoreland, and in 2010, right, he was the one to find her. He found her himself. He's driven a long way to speak to us today, so please help me welcome Ross Richardson.
Sure I don't knock that over. Hi, can everybody hear me okay? Yes. Okay, great. Oops. Let me get this fired up here. There we go. Well, the Westmoreland story has it all. A shipwreck, sunken treasure, hard hat diving, barrels of whiskey, and a cast of characters as diverse as the personalities in this room here today. For over 150 years, the Westmoreland has been one of the most sought-after shipwrecks in the Great Lakes. And today we're going to learn about the people who searched for her and then maybe go down and visit her ourselves. Again, my name's Ross Richardson. I have a website, MichiganMysteries.com, that is dedicated to missing aircraft, missing ships, missing people in the Michigan region. If you have a chance and are interested in mysteries, stop by the website and look around. I'm also working on my next book, which is going to be concerning those very things. You'd be amazed at the amount of missing aircraft there are in the Michigan region, and that's where I got a lot of my training, is when I linked in with Clive Cussler's NUMA team and their search for Flight 2501, a missing Northwest Airlines DC-4 that disappeared over Lake Michigan with 58 people on it in 1950. They're still looking for it. They're going to be back this spring looking for it, and hopefully I can go back out with the guys and spend some time on the boat. I've also had the pleasure of working with David Trotter from Canton, Michigan, not too far from here, and I got a lot of training working with him before I kind of branched off on my own and started doing my own wreck hunting. I'm from Lake Ann, Michigan. How many people have been to Lake Ann? Ooh, okay. Very small town up in the Grand Traverse region. Yeah, there it is on the map. To give you an idea, Benzie County, which is the county I live in, has 18,000 year-round residents. We have one McDonald's in the whole county. No Taco Bell, no Wendy's, none of those fancy restaurants. So it's a pretty remote area. It's pretty secluded up there, and it can be very isolating in the winter, which I just drove down. Now, we had a foot of snow in the driveway since last night when I pulled out, so it's like snowbanks this high. When I get to Cadillac's always the line. Everything south of Cadillac is about half as much snow, and then I get down here and it's like, wow, it's like April. I'm a librarian at the Elmira Township Library. A lot of this information we're going to go over I found on those late nights of volunteering during the winter when I wouldn't get any patrons, and I go through the local history section and local history books, old ones, obscure books, and just peruse for information on the Westmoreland. I'm also a diver with the Benzie County Sheriff's Dive Team. We're a volunteer group, again, being a very small population up there. We volunteer our services to provide for the county because we just don't have the tax base to provide a lot of services. On to the legend of the Westmoreland. As with all stories, some things are based, or some legends are always based on truth, and here's some of these legends about it. The legend of the Westmoreland is fueled by stories from books and old newspaper articles. Martin Melkeld's book, Log Cabin Tales of Leelanau, says this: the sinking of the Westmoreland. Frank Fisher arrived as a boy to Glen Arbor with his parents from Wisconsin to homestead property near Sleeping Bear on August 8, 1854, 4 months prior to the sinking of the Westmoreland. He was told of her sinking by Paul Pelkey, one of the crew survivors aboard the Westmoreland. He said when the Westmoreland started to sink, the captain with his crew tried to arouse the 17 lumberjacks aboard who had begun a drunken party soon after leaving Chicago. This proved to be of no avail, and the captain was forced to leave them when launching the ship's yawl. It's reported the Westmoreland carried aboard a shipment of $10,000 in gold and other valuables in her safe, and securely battened in her hold lies 2,800 casks of ripe whiskey. Another book, Long Ships Passing, says this: one of the memorable losses on Lake Michigan is that of the steamer Westmoreland. Somewhere in the wide northern waters, she sank with $100,000 in gold in her safe. The crew saved themselves and lived to tell the story of 17 lumberjacks who locked themselves in their cabin at the first sign of storm. They had grown familiar with the perils of falling timber and the treacherous skid road, but they had no stomach for a storm at sea. Around a barrel of whiskey in that lurching cabin, they drank away their fears and their senses while the waters of Lake Michigan closed over them. Alita Makis's book, Blue Water Boundary, states this: the steamer Westmoreland sank on Lake Michigan in a frightful storm. She had $100,000 in gold in her safe. There were 17 lumberjacks who traditionally could not swim. They had a barrel of whiskey in their cabin and had been drinking and playing cards during the storm. They refused to move when the cry came to abandon ship, and they locked themselves in their cabin, according to the story. Years later, divers trying to locate the gold peered through the cabin portholes, and there they saw the lumberjacks, still sitting around the barrel, cards floating around them. Okay, one more. Well-known author and master of Great Lakes lore, Frederick Stonehouse, wrote a similar story in his book, Haunted Lake Michigan. One of the earliest underwater ghost tales involves the wooden propeller Westmoreland. Because of the rumored gold aboard, she'd been a much sought-after wreck by divers through the years. There's a wonderful tale that soon after the loss, salvagers who promptly put a hard-hat diver down and found the wreck. He reported the vessel sitting upright and relatively undamaged. Working his way into one of the cabins, he discovered half a dozen lumberjacks, still seated around a table playing cards. The stack of coins was piled high in the center of the table, and each man's grub stake was still in front of him. Several of the jacks clutched cards in their hoary hands. The diver closed the door and left, never finding the gold cargo. All right, let's talk gold. The original legends say it was $10,000 in gold coins. That would be in $20 double eagles, as they were called. Now, each of those double eagles, there were 500 of them, contained 0.9675 ounces of pure gold. So if we were to take those gold coins and melt them down, we'd end up with 483.75 ounces. Now, in today's prices of gold, that's about $750,000, just if we melted it down. But the true value is the numismatic value of those coins. Coin value, depending on condition, have gone at auction from between $6,600 and $75,000 per coin. So that means this money these days could be worth anywhere from $3 million to $37.5 million. Which is my wife has always encouraged me, go get that gold, go find it. So yeah, that sounds really easy, doesn't it? Until you get down there. Okay, on to the ship. There were no known photographs of the Westmoreland. Just this line drawing from Collingwood, Ontario, the Huron Institute there, and it was based on a photograph that was thought destroyed in a fire in 1970. The Westmoreland was built in Ohio City on the Cayuga River just west of where downtown Cleveland now stands. She was 200 feet long, made of wood, only 28 feet wide, so a very narrow vessel, not much wider than that front pew section there. She cost $36,000 to build. She was launched in early July of 1853. Her design, it was early in the design, but it became commonplace in the Great Lakes. If you look here, this is called a hogging arch. And what happened is in the 1840s, 1850s, ship size just exploded. It went from 100, 130 feet to 200, 240 feet, and they really didn't know how to build these hulls strong enough. They would kind of droop. So they came up with this idea here, the hogging arch, which is really a suspension bridge built on the ship to give it strength. If we look at, we see all these wires here. Those are ropes. The Westmoreland didn't have any wire on it whatsoever. Wire wasn't they would call it wire or metal rope, cable. Yeah, cable is the metal, wire rope. There's a name, but everything was rope on this, hemp rope, because, again, cables weren't introduced until after the Civil War on Great Lakes shipping. Again, another shot, we see some gangways here. A gentleman probably painting the ship, gives you an idea of the scale of the ship. Up here would be the passenger cabins, and up on top here we see some davits. The pilot house up here, very ornate. The anchors were stored up here. This was where most of the cargo was stored or brought in through these gangways, and then lowered down to the bilge level. There's a whole level here underwater that we don't see. This is a great picture. It gives us an idea of the scale. Again, some guy sitting there in the gangway. Very ornate eagle on top of the pilot house. Anchor stored up front. Big, tall smokestack. Really, there's a level down here, so this is about 4 levels high or 4 stories high. And again, those hogging arches, probably the most prominent feature on the ship. The Westmoreland didn't burn coal, it burned cordwood. It would burn a cord of wood an hour under normal circumstances. So a cord of wood is a 4 foot by 4 foot by 8 foot stack of wood. So to run from Buffalo to Chicago, it's usually it probably would take a room this size filled with wood to make that voyage one way. So it had a lot of stops. Well, we wonder where all our virgin timber went. A lot of it went up the old smokestack. Probably smelled pretty good though. The Westmoreland was one of the most technologically advanced machines on the planet in 1853. It's easy to see where a captain could become overconfident and gain a sense of invincibility. A newspaper article from December 1853 states, "Lake clearance. The Chicago Journal says the Petrel clears today for Buffalo with a cargo of corn. The propeller Westmoreland is also taking on a cargo. This is the latest vessels have ever cleared for the lower lakes." So obviously with this new technology, the captains were pushing the shipping season longer and longer. Let's see how that worked out for them. Exactly 1 year later, early December 1854, the Westmoreland was in Chicago being loaded with oats, flour, wool, butter, pork, and beef. The supplies were meant for the garrison on Mackinac Island. The Westmoreland also took on passengers, including William Saltonstall. William Saltonstall was contracted by the U.S. government to supply the garrison on Mackinac Island with provisions. Saltonstall would bring a load of provisions to the island late in the fall, usually upon the last trip of a steamboat before navigation closed. He would arrive at the island and leave his supplies with the clerk. He would then put on his snowshoes, hitch his 2 dogs to a sled, and hike to Detroit. Then he would head home by rail to join his family in Chicago. While he was aboard the Westmoreland, he kept his sled dogs chained in his cabin. The Westmoreland left Chicago on Saturday, December 2nd, and reached Milwaukee about noon and took on another 500 barrels of flour. On Wednesday the 6th, she left for the Manitou Passage, the shortest route to Mackinac Island from Milwaukee. The weather was described as fair. About 4 in the afternoon on the same day, a thick snowstorm came up and a heavy sea and a wind from the northwest. At 4 a.m. on Thursday morning, the Westmoreland was discovered to be leaking. The bilge pump was unable to keep her free from water, and 2 additional hand pumps were ordered working. Around 6 a.m., the leak increased because of the mountainous seas and the large quantity of ice that had accumulated on the vessel. Fearing they would lose steam and their lives, the crew commenced hoisting water from the hold with firemen's buckets. On 10 a.m. Thursday morning, the Westmoreland was about 2.5 miles off South Manitou Island and within sight of the lighthouse there. The water rising in her hold put the Westmoreland's boiler fires out, and she started drifting to the south. Now, if you've been to Sleeping Bear Dune's right there. The Westmoreland carried auxiliary sails, but her jib was embedded in ice and her foresail was split. She was entirely at the mercy of the wind and waves and continued drifting down the Michigan coast for 4 hours until nearly 3 o'clock when she began to go down rapidly. The order to abandon ship was given, and the 2 smaller yawl boats were launched quickly. So quickly, William Saltonstall didn't have time to unchain his dogs that were still in his cabin. The largest boat was launched last and got jammed between the upper cabin and the lifeboat davit the crane used to launch the lifeboat, and it was capsized, throwing its 15 passengers into the icy water. Several of the men who were tossed from the large lifeboat were last seen clinging to the arches as the Westmoreland went down. The sounds of the storm were deafening. People were yelling and screaming, and the whines and howls of William Saltonstall's sled dogs could be heard as the 2 small yawls started for shore. When the survivors were about 150 feet from their propeller, it went down with a crash, the cabins parting from the hull as she sank. The 15 passengers and crew who were left behind either froze to death or drowned in the frigid water. The 2 lifeboats were filled with as many as they could carry, and the boats pulled away and headed for shore. The waves were huge, and the survivors did their best to avoid the cakes of floating ice in the large seas. The boats landed at Platte River Bay. The second boat rolled in the breakers and killed 2 of its crew. The boat was soon righted and pulled ashore. The survivors went back into the woods and built a cabin of branches and a fire and remained there overnight. The next morning, the 3rd boat was found bottom side up on the beach, having drifted ashore. The beach was strewn for miles with barrels of flour, pork, butter, and wreckage from the shipwreck. 3 Westmoreland crew members walked to Manistee from Platte Bay and took the schooner Whirlwind to Racine and reported the accident. The rest of the crew and passengers headed north and spent the winter with early settlers, the Fisher family, in Glen Arbor. Captain Clark walked from Glen Arbor to Grand Haven, a trip of 160 miles. He walked during the day and slept in the woods at night, and it took him 6 days. Boy, that's a rough ride. Glen Arbor to Glen Haven, let alone walk it, man. For the next 150 years, the Westmoreland would become one of the most sought-after shipwrecks in the Great Lakes, with around 20 expeditions launched to find her and her treasures. The first expedition to search for the Westmoreland was launched in 1872 by the Westmoreland's former first mate, Paul Pelkey. Pelkey, born on Mackinac Island in 1825, became a sailor at age 14. In 1853, he took position of first mate on the steamer Westmoreland. After nearly 2 decades after the Westmoreland's sinking, Pelkey captained a number of steamers and tugged successfully and became known as one of the most skillful navigators on the lakes. In July of 1872, Captain Pelkey returned to the Manitou Passage and was said to have found the wreck. After the sinking, Pelkey had taken bearings from shore of where the ship went down, and he supposedly found her almost immediately and placed buoys to mark the wreck site. Nothing more was heard about Pelkey's quest until July of 1874, when the Lake Michigan submarine wrecking crew, led by Captain Peter Falcon, salvaged the engine boiler off the sunken steamer Milwaukee and cargo of nearby schooner Tiffany. The Milwaukee was in 100 feet of water. The salvage crew, using hard hat dive gear, would fillet the wreck open and then hook pontoons onto the boiler and machinery and fill it with air and lift it to the surface. When they were done salvaging these wrecks, they went to Beaver Island and picked up Paul Pelkey, who was there waiting for them, and they proceeded to the waters off Sleeping Bear Dune, where they spent over a month in an attempt to salvage the Westmoreland. A Chicago Journal article dated October 21, 1874 states, "The engines, etc. of the propeller Westmoreland sunk 17 years ago, arrived here. Having been raised by the active, she is in the employ of the Lake Michigan Submarine Wrecking Company. The only thing heard of Paul Pelkey after that, looking for the Westmoreland, was a cryptic entry made in the Journal of the Point Betsy Lighthouse Station dated May 18, 1875. It stated, "Captain Pelkey borrowed the Seagull, look for the Westmoreland." Paul Pelkey, captain of the tug J.W. Bennett, in 1876. On November 18th of that year, the J.W. Bennett ran aground in the Straits of Mackinac and laid over on her side. The crew of 6 men and 1 passenger remained on board the Bennett to keep up steam and not let her fill with water. To keep warm, they went into the room over the boiler and closed the doors. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the lockup safety valve opened suddenly and filled the room with steam. Captain Pelkey was scalded to death and died instantly. The others were skinned from head to foot by the hot water and steam combined. The bodies were taken to Mackinac, and in transporting the body of the cook, he actually fell apart, so they had to sew him in canvas to carry him. This was a tragic end to a really great sailor, and almost the end of the story. Over a half century would pass before another Westmoreland expedition was reported on. An article from Glen Arbor, dated December 14, 1929, states, "Glen Haventar would raise sunken wine ship. Frankie Fisher buys Coast Guard craft and now seriously ponders salvaging 2,000 barrels of vintage. 2,000 barrels of high-class wines in the ship's hold and $10,000 in specie in the ship's safe." That's the story that was told about the Westmoreland. The story is vividly brought to mind by 78-year-old Frankie Fisher of Glen Haven, who was only 3 years old at the time of the shipwreck. Even at an early age, he gained a definite impression of the tragedy, and many times Frank heard his father, John Fisher, when he was still living, tell the story of the wreck. He recalls that workmen dragged for 3 weeks trying to locate the ship, and how his father pointed out time and again the exact spot where the Westmoreland sank. Now, nothing more is heard of his expedition. Frank passed away shortly after this article was published, so who knows if he actually got on the water to look for the wreck. The 1936 expedition actually had its genesis in 1917 with the sinking of the Cunard liner Lusitania. The Lusitania was torpedoed by German U-boat U-20 on May 7, 1950, and sank in 18 minutes, killing 1,198 people. The Lusitania was reported to be carrying between $2 and $15 million in gold bullion in her strong room, plus $300,000 in currency and jewels in the purser's safe. In 1935, the Tritonia Corporation of Glasgow, Scotland, put a diver on the Lusitania. The diver used the Tritonia atmospheric diving suit. The suit was really a miniature submarine, and the diver could operate as the same pressure as above water, allowing the diver and suit to ascend to the surface immediately without decompression stops. And the suit proved to be impractical because of mobility issues, and it was realized that penetrating the Lusitania's hull would require a much more mobile diving apparatus. In January of 1936, the Tritonia Corporation approached John D. Craig, an American businessman, author, soldier, deep-sea diver, Hollywood stuntman, and film producer. How'd you like those credits? Yeah. About creating a diving rig that could be used to salvage the Lusitania. John Craig's friend, Max Knoll, a young MIT graduate from Wisconsin, was already working on a diving rig that would be perfect for the project. In spring of 1936, Max Knoll and his 19-year-old friend, Jack Brown, completed work on the diving rig and set out to find and salvage the Westmoreland. After weeks of failure, they hired Captain George Waters and his boat, the Grace W., to help them in their search. Captain George Waters, pictured here, was told of the contents of the Westmoreland strongbox and the location of the wreck when he was a teenager in the 1870s by none other than Paul Pelkey, the former first mate of the Westmoreland. With Captain Waters' knowledge, they were said to have found the Westmoreland within days and began diving operations. To dive the wreck, Knoll and Brown used the prototype dive gear which they had designed and built right in Milwaukee to dive. The gear they used didn't use the surface applied air. If you ever see those hard hat divers, they got the big hose coming down. They didn't have that. This was a rebreather system that was similar to the scuba systems used today. They went around, they tied a rope around their waist. That's it. So this is some pretty early, pretty cool diving. The following is from Max Knoll's memoir describing their efforts. He says, "Scores of snags showed up but offered no clue to suggest anything but a log or rock. Day after day slipped by. Then one cold morning, our drags caught up in an awful snarl. We had 22 fathoms of water beneath us, that's 132 feet, which would be an ideal depth for a test of the new air apparatus. Jack dressed me in customary fashion, but instead of connecting the air hose to the helmet, he slung the unit around my back and over I went with merely a rope around my waist to serve as an emergency lifeline. I landed on a flat section of her planked hull. The water was a little cloudy and there was probably 10 feet of visibility. It was without a doubt the Westmoreland. I was well familiar with vessels of her day and the details of their construction. We also had a fairly good description of her. There was no nameplate to read, nor was there much of a resemblance of a ship at all. Just a hunk of keel here, and a piece of planking there, and a forlorn frame protruding up out of the sand, like the marker of a long-forgotten grave. Wreckage was strewn about every place, but it was as far from a complete ship as a pile of lumber would be from a finished vessel proudly sliding down the ways. It was fascinating fun trying piece by piece, like a crossword puzzle, to reconstruct from her bones the once mighty ship. The thought of locating the whiskey kegs was almost funny when there wasn't even a vessel herself to be found. However, this very minute we could be walking over gold ingots, only a few feet of soft, white sand between us. But to start looking for them would probably most simply be accomplished by just draining Lake Michigan. Digging in submerged sands, any beach playboy has observed, is a rewardless task, the hole filling in just as it's excavated. However, this dire was a triumph in my young life. The suit worked like a charm. At this depth, 130 feet, it was giving me air sweeter than I had ever known before. And this is considered very deep water for a diver. On the last dive, Jack came up with excited news. He found money. "Look," he sputtered as we removed the helmet from his head. "I have it right here in my pocket." He produced a corroded greenish flat disc the size of a quarter. It was a big copper penny. We quickly scraped off the scum, and there was the story. The Westmoreland had sank in 1854. It was an 1851 penny. Jack had found it wedged into a crack of one of her planks. The following year, 1937, Max Knoll, who was only 26 years old, made a dive to the world record depth of 420 feet in Lake Michigan using diving gear tested during the Westmoreland expedition. That same year, Jack Brown and Norman Keene founded DESCO, the Diving Equipment and Salvage Company, a major dive equipment manufacturer which supplied commercial diving equipment to the U.S. Navy as well as private individuals and companies. By the end of World War II, DESCO was making more dive equipment than all the other dive equipment manufacturers in the world combined. Max Knoll became a diving legend. His involvement with the salvage of one of Milwaukee's best-known wrecks, the Prince Willem, is still talked about in diving circles. In 1960, while returning from their vacation, Max and his wife Eleanor Knoll were tragically killed in an automobile accident near Hope, Arkansas. Killed in the other car was Jesse Belvin and wife Joanne. Belvin was a rising R&B singer and co-writer of the 50s hit song Earth Angel. Max Knoll also became a diving legend. His Jack Brown full face mask was used by commercial divers around the world for decades. One of my favorites, Frankfurt resident Captain George Waters, who had them on his boat looking for the Westmoreland, was born July 6, 1856. When he was a child, Captain Waters met Abraham Lincoln and sat on his lap. Captain Waters' family lived in Wilmington, Delaware, and his father was friends with Lincoln, who would visit their house occasionally. The Waters family relocated to Frankfurt around 1860, and sometime around 1874, Cap Waters became acquainted with Captain Paul Pelkey. Waters received his captain papers at age 21. At age 92, he piloted his open Chris Craft speedboat to Mackinac City with his son Norman. He dropped Norman off and continued up to the Sioux Locks by himself. After making the locks, he returned to Frankfurt all by himself in an open boat. That's at age 92. At age 97, he took a motorboat from Frankfurt to Charlevoix and back all by himself. Captain Waters passed away in December of 1853. He was 97 years old. In 1954, Captain Harold Van Nyman of Flint, Michigan, and his team of divers spent the summer searching for the wreck and claimed to have found her and her valuable cargo. Van, as he was called by friends, quickly made friends with local historian Art Fredrickson and writer Roy Sparkia. In an article from 1954, Captain Van Nyman said, "The Westmoreland, when first discovered, was submerged approximately 2/3 under sand, with only portions of the pilot house and cabins and stacks visible. The upper hatch over the machinery compartment was open, and the visible space was nearly filled with silt." The article also stated, "Unseasonably rough weather prevented further diving operations until last May 17th, when the vessel was found uncovered still more, and less than 1/3 of the hull still under sand. The divers were able to penetrate the pitch-dark and silt-filled machinery compartment and got into the pilot house. They were unable to identify little other than stacked barrels." The following year, 1955, Van Nyman was arrested on charges of fraud. It seems a good captain told investors that they would receive an excellent return on their investment if they funded his Westmoreland search. Van Nyman was arrested but never charged. In writing the book about the Westmoreland, I tracked down some of these people and got to talk to some of the family. Like I got to talk to Captain Van Nyman's 5th wife. And he was quite a character. He was a good-looking guy, and he just had a presence about him, very charismatic. And she told me none of his wives ever remarried because, quote, "once you had Van, you couldn't go back to an ordinary man." And she was about 20 years younger than him. So this is quite an interesting character, but yet, on the other hand, he was a decorated World War II combat veteran, a hero. He was in a Pacific battle. His grandparents had to sign to let him join the Marines when he was 17, and he had battlefield commendations for heroism. You know, so it's quite an amazing depth to his character, but just one of the many interesting characters we get to come across in researching this. The Sawtelle Expedition. In 1957, a young man named Jim Sawtelle and his wife Nancy and their 3 children arrived in Frankfurt. The following Grand Rapids Press article from September 30, 1957 gives us insight into their activities. "Treasure lures divers. Wrecks are legendary. Jim was first attracted to Frankfurt because of the proximity to the most fabulous of Great Lakes wrecks, the legendary Westmoreland, sunk in Platte Bay off the mouth of Otter Creek in a severe storm in 1854. The Westmoreland reportedly carried $100,000 in gold in the safe for a lumber camp payroll and 280 barrels of high wine, a brandy, as part of the cargo. Passengers of the ill-fated voyage were believed to have had much jewelry stored in the ship's safe. According to Sawtelle, who did 2.5 years research on the Westmoreland, a liquor expert recently guessed that the 70,000 fifths of liquor aboard if still in original condition in the casks, would retail now at about $3.5 million. That was in 1957, so that might even be worth $4 million now, who knows? Jim spent more than a decade looking for the Westmoreland. He started out by using 1,000 feet of glider cable wire hooked between two boats to drag the bottom of Lake Michigan. Later, he got this instrument, a magnetometer, which is like a giant underwater metal detector. But with the primitive navigation back then, it was very hard to search, and he never did find the Westmoreland. What Jim is probably best known for is his Shipwreck Restaurant and bar interiors and shipwreck furniture. If you go to Mackinac Island, you ever go in one of the bars and they have the shipwreck, that was done by Jim. There's some of his furniture. He sold it first in Leland and then Charlevoix, Michigan. So if you ever see the shipwreck furniture, yeah, pretty neat stuff. Some people are a little uptight about it because sometimes Jim would take the wood off a wreck. Sometimes he would pry it off. Sometimes he'd dynamite it off. And, you know, these historic wrecks from the 1800s, people would, oh my gosh. So he's one of the reasons we have the shipwreck laws we do now where you just leave everything there. But he just took them from shoreline wrecks and he made some beautiful furniture. Some more pieces. He made furniture for the Van Andel family, for their primary residence in Grand Rapids, the Amway family, and the Dow residence, Herbie Dow, on Crystal Lake, up by Frankfurt. So he did some furniture for some famous people. He says he built 12,000 pieces for 7,000 people over his career. Next up is Frank Delano. Frank looked for the Westmoreland from 1967 to 1971. After the discovery was announced, Frank gave me a call and we got talking. And I realized that I lived within a few miles of Frank almost my whole life. But, who would have known he looked for it back when I was, he started looking the year I was born. So it's just one of those interesting things that we had this commonality, and I drove by his house going to work for years in Grand Rapids, and never knew it until afterwards. We became friends, and pretty interesting stuff. Gene Turner and Bill Byers looked in the 1970s. They would use a planer board. Gene is a very prolific shipwreck hunter. He's found many wrecks in Lake Michigan, a few in Lake Huron, and he would drag Bill behind on what's called a planer board. So he would be underwater, and he would have a Jack Brown full face mask with comm gear, and they would talk back and forth, and he would look around for shipwrecks. One thing they did notice is the underwater hills. If you ever been to Leelanau County and notice how hilly it is, it's like that underwater. It's not level. I mean, there's mountains under there and cliffs and everything. So that's one thing he notices. It's a very very rugged underwater terrain. And they saw pieces of wood, but nothing they thought resembled a shipwreck. These young guys, I love this picture, right out of the early 80s with the cut-off jeans and everything, that's pretty cool. The guy in the middle is Jed Jawarski. He's from Frankfurt, Michigan, and had a lot of insight and offering on some of these searches. They searched in this boat for a while. They had a surplus Navy sonar in here, and they would send off a ping, submarine hunting sonar, and they would sit back there and listen for the return of a shipwreck. But in that area, it's very tough to search with that type of sonar. David Gruber, another Grand Rapids guy, he looked for a few years. He ended up dying down in South America looking for Incan treasure in the mountains under mysterious circumstances. So a treasure hunter. Captain Bill Prince. Early on in my career researching, I linked up with Bill. And that's the Klein sonar right there. I linked up with him. He had a boat and a sonar. I was in the library all the time, so it was a great combination. He didn't want to do the research. I didn't have any equipment at the time. So we went up to Frankfurt in 2006, I believe, and searched for the Westmoreland. His expensive sonar fish, we promptly flew it into the side of an underwater hill and tore it all up. We learned quickly that, those cliffs and hills under there. So unfortunately, Bill passed away a couple years after this in 2008, and we never had a chance to go back and search together. So now comes my story. All right. I love the story of the Westmoreland because of the interesting characters, the treasure aspect of it. It was a beautiful ship in its time, almost brand new. So I decided to go out and look for it myself. And when I started searching, I didn't even have a boat. I had to convince my wife we needed a family boat. And then, so I talked her into it, right? And she's like, what are we always doing over here? So after getting a feel for the area, I said, well, now I needed to get a family sonar. That was a harder sell. She wasn't real hip to it. She's been a very gracious woman. She allowed me to get it. So I researched, and I came up with an idea. The Jack Brown and Max Noel in 1936, they said they were diving on the Westmoreland. I mean, this was an MIT graduate. He's a bright guy, right? He's going to know if he's on the ship. Well, he gave the depth at 130 feet and described it as, let's see, a piece of plank here, a hunk of keel there. Jack Brown, in a newspaper article I found from 1936, said they found the hulk badly broken up 120 feet below the surface. So I had some reasonable depths to start looking. And then there was that article that the boiler and engine showed up in Chicago in 1874 from Paul Pelkey's expedition. Hard hat diving at that time, 100 foot was about the limit. They could get down to 130, 140 was really sketchy. So I thought, if it was in this 120, 130 foot range, then there's a chance these guys had found it. If I go back, all I need to do is find some wood, some timber sticking out of the bottom, and I can tell this great story. So I started searching for this ship on my own, kind of like my Moby Dick, I guess. Well, I was out there by myself. I couldn't find anybody to go out there with me search. I'd say, hey, somebody want to go for a boat ride? They'd be, yeah. I'd say, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to look at a computer screen for 10 hours and then go back and forth. No one bit on that. So I was out there by myself, July 7th, 2010, and across the monitor came this interesting, and it's just a little something, but I was at the end of a run and I was turning around and I knew I'd get a better shot at it. And that's what I ran over. And it was about 200 feet long. And it looks kind of broken up. So I got pretty excited, right? So I called my buddy Jim Sawtelle, the furniture guy, and doing my research, we had become friends over the years. So we're the only ones who could talk Westmoreland because nobody else wanted to hear this. Until you find it, no one wants to hear about the stuff. So I called, I said, Jim, I got a big target. And he says, well, finish your run, come back over it, and go over it again and see what you see. So I had him on the phone, and I started getting images like this. And I was getting pretty excited. What do those look like? Hogging arches. Man, so I'm like, whoa, Jim. So I went over the top with a downward-looking sonar and spiked that 30 feet off the bottom. 30, that's big. That's big. So I was pretty excited. So I'm like, Jim, I think we got something here. I went home and did some comparisons. Could be. Little similarity there. So the next thing is to dive it. I couldn't be 100% sure that was a Westmoreland or even a shipwreck. I didn't know what it was. I knew it was something big down there, and it was deep. It wasn't in 120, 130. It was more like 200 feet of water in that area, which was a deep dive. So I decided to go down and try to film it. So with just me and my brother on the boat, we went out there, and we grappled into this thing, right? Just like with a big anchor and hooked it up. There's my brother. This is actual footage of the first dive. I got this underwater camera and housing on eBay for $95. And it was an old, but it worked, right? It was an old piece of junk, and I had some spare parts, and I got it working. So this is the camera. Remember, I'm a pretty low budget operation. So down the line I went after I got all my gear on. I looked down, and below me I saw the bow of an enormous ship. The water was cold down there. It was about 40 degrees. I had about 50 or 60 foot visibility. And I hovered about 10 feet off the deck of this big ship, and I thought to myself, I need to go back a little further, because if I can film those arches, if I see arches, that'll be proof. I saw a mast broken off. It was about the same diameter as a telephone pole, about 6 or 8 feet above the deck. I could see the passenger cabins were gone and the wheelhouse. Eyewitnesses said the cabins parted from the wreck. She went down with a bang. There was no current on the site. It was very cold, very still. Yeah, that's when I knew I had her, that shot right there. Those arches are about 12 feet high. It's hard to scale it without another diver, but they're big. And again, the ship's about 28 feet across. So I could see the deck was collapsed between the arches. The passenger deck had actually collapsed down onto the cargo deck. I felt pretty good, and I thought I'd go back a little bit further and see if the engine and boiler were there or if they were salvaged. There's the lifeboat davits. Remember the story? The lifeboat getting hooked? So that was an eerie feeling. And there's the smokestack base, the boiler right below it, and the engine cylinder head. So this wasn't a salvage shipwreck. And the lifeboat davits, those are about 12 to 14 feet high. I decided I came this far, I might as well go back to the very back of the ship. And out of the gloom appeared a perfectly intact 4-foot ship's wheel, the auxiliary helm. And one word raced through my mind: virgin. This was the Westmoreland, and she was a virgin wreck. Nobody had been here. In the next couple years, we explored the Westmoreland, and she revealed herself to us, her legend, her history, and her wreck site. The auxiliary helm, not a spoke out of place, which is remarkable considering the Westmoreland went nearly vertical when she sank. Quagga mussels cover the wreck. Used to be zebra mussels. Quagga mussels now represent 90% of the mussels in the Great Lakes. They're a little bit bigger and much more resilient, and they go a lot deeper. They obscure the wreck, but they give us this great visibility that we have. This is probably 60-foot visibility. The lifeboat davits. Again, one of those hooked the last lifeboat launch, spilling the 15 people right here. They all drowned right here on the stern of the Westmoreland over 15 decades ago. Going down, we see a propeller blade and the rudder. The auxiliary helm is about 20 to 25 feet off the bottom. Again, there's the propeller and the rudder with its unusual double attachment point. A little deck collapse there so you can enter the engine room, which is right here. Wreckage is strewn all over the bottom, including china.
How deep did you say you were down?
This is 180 feet. It's 30 feet from the bottom of Lake Michigan to the top of the Hogging Arch. Here's a gangway wide open. The gangway hatch was probably blown off when the ship sank. We can see the deck behind it collapse down. and the Hogging Arches. Eyewitnesses said victims were hanging on the Hogging Arches as the Westmoreland went down, clinging for life.
Now, if there were any treasure in there, you said everything fell into the boat, so anything would be underneath. Stuff.
This image of the Westmoreland wreck site shows us an opening we can go into at the bow. With the forward bulwarks missing, it's easy to enter the Westmoreland. There's a port side anchor hanging down, knocked loose during the sinking. The starboard side anchor lays back about 60 feet. A heavy coating of Quagga mussels obscures the oak timbers. The water temperature is 39 degrees as we enter a room that has been unseen by human eyes for over a decade before Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. The windlass, chain still wrapped around it. Again, a coating of Quagga mussels. Signs of the violent sinking are everywhere. Broken wood strewn about. And there's a cargo container. Probably had some cargo meant for the garrison at Fort Mackinac. And behind that, a staircase, still intact, rising up to the passenger deck. As we head towards the stern, we come to an opening, one of the only openings to the yet unexplored bilge level. Well, you can see I'm kind of a history nut. And sometimes that history, you cross over into a different, it's almost like a split personality, because the guy in the library is different from the guy who goes inside the shipwreck and has a different mentality. Here's my book, The Search for the Westmoreland. I'm pretty proud of it, 316 pages that really goes in depth on some of the searchers and tells a little bit of my story also. It's also available on Kindle at Amazon.com. So if you want a signed copy, they're $19.95. They're great if you know somebody who enjoys history or enjoys maritime things, shipwreck diving. This is the book for them. Well, thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate you having me here today. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Any questions? No, it's illegal to take things. And I know I wanted to write a book, so I know people were going to be watching me very closely. Plus, my son, who's 7 years old, his best friend 2 doors down, his dad's a DNR officer. So there's about 10 really solid reasons for me not to take anything. Plus, my wife, she doesn't want that junk around the house. So I am, if you know where Empire, Michigan is, I'm talking with the museum there, because this wreck is very close to that museum. And if the state says it's okay, and I don't want to get involved in that, I agree, artifacts should be grounded. This is an amazing, you go down there and reach into that muck, and you pull up a dish, and it's brand new from 1854, not a nick, not a scratch. I mean, they're just laying out there. So wouldn't it be great to bring it up in a place where people can see? Now, it used to be trophy hunters used to take all the china off the shipwrecks, but today the new trophy is video. We can go down there with our video cameras and actually bring you into the shipwreck, and you can explore it with us, other than if I were just to hold up a piece of china right now. It'd be cool, but that's the new trophy. So there's a different mentality in divers these days towards preservation, and that's where I err on the side of just leave it all down there. And, because wouldn't it be great if our granddaughters and grandsons, or great-granddaughters and great-grandsons, could dive this wreck someday and see everything just like it was from 1854.
Is there a finder's fee? I mean, did you?
It goes the other way. With gas money, sonar. What's that?
You paid them, the government?
Well, I had to finance my expedition myself, so I haven't talked to the state of Michigan about it. In my past dealings with the state, I don't think they're exactly, at least in the past, have been shipwreck hunter friendly. And I also wanted to do this on my own. I didn't want to have to go to the government and have them help me with the project. I wanted to be able to show people that they can record history themselves and share it without having help. So everything I did here, I paid for myself, and there is no money unless I find the gold chest. But
So actually, the government owns it.
the state of Michigan says they own it.
So-
Notice how I didn't say the state of Michigan owns it. I says they say they own it. I'm not going to contest that, though.
Oh, no, you can't find somebody like that. So when you said there was an opening you could see down in there, could you have reached in there and brought something up?
Oh yeah, there's stuff in there. I'm sure there's steamer trunks from the passengers. The whiskey is probably in the bilge level. You're going to help me have a couple sips? So there's stuff in that area, but it's, one of my friends was like, we could take our tanks off, squeeze into that hole, pull our tanks in, put them on, and I'm like, I don't think so.
Could you get this on the History Channel? Can you submit it? Because I know all the men would really like this.
Was this on, you ever hear the show Moonshiners? There's a show on, is it A&E? Well, I was approached by the production company. They actually showed my picture on there when Tickle was finding some moonshine or something. I'm not familiar with the show, but I was on that. Now, as for a documentary, I would be interested. I think the story has really been flying low under the radar. It's a great story. So we'll see what happens. Maybe the wreck site is gorgeous. It's probably one of the best preserved shipwrecks from the 1850s on the planet. So if there was a Nat Geo special, I think that'd be great, but I haven't been approached seriously by anybody.
I mean, could you
Yeah.
contact the History Channel and just with a cover letter about it or anything? Because it seems so good.
Yeah, I think so too. I was approached by Discovery Channel production company, and they said they didn't think it was a good story. They told me if I found the gold to give them a call, then they might be interested. That was early on, though.
How far offshore was it actually?
Surprisingly, just a few miles. I sit there, when we dive, we look right at Sleeping Bear Dune and the Empire Bluffs, and it's just beautiful area, very remote, no other boat traffic. There's nobody out. I mean, that area, it's because there's no harbors between Frankfurt and Leland, if you know the area. So it's a pretty remote area, but it's not that far offshore. I've led people in the past to believe it was way offshore, but they almost made it. Another hour, they would have washed up on shore. Everybody would have lived.
Yeah, are there specialty divers that would go through that hole that maybe you could take us to the next level of the gold or the whiskey or whatever?
If I'm not interested in that, or am I interested in sending somebody else down there? It's dangerous. The diving at that level is very dangerous. Then when you go into that, it's just not worth it. Maybe we'll send a ROV if somebody wants to sacrifice. Yeah, a robot down there.
Those casks with whiskey, won't it disintegrate eventually?
Not if they're in oaken barrels. Oak is very resilient. No, oak, if it was pine, it would. Did I see a hand back here?
How come you didn't have a family dive?
I don't want my kids or family to dive. It's it's not safe.
Saving of the ship to the temperature of the water, is that?
That's a big reason. At that depth, the water's always 39 degrees year-round. Very cold. The sunlight used to not be able to get down that far until the Quagga Mussels cleaned it up. Now there's ambient light down there most of the time. Sometimes it can be a little dark and gloomy. But the cold water and a lack of current. It sits in a hole with cliff walls around it, so there's never any current in that area, because current will really hurt a shipwreck. So it's an unusual geographic feature, which is another reason why I think it wasn't found in the past, is because they didn't have the navigation equipment to figure out how that bottom topography lays out in that area, because the NOAA map is wrong. The government mapped it incorrectly, and it's hidden in that incorrect mapped area.
Could it be brought up? Could it be raised?
It could be raised, but then it would deteriorate very quickly, and it would be very expensive, and it's never worked out to raise a Great Lakes shipwreck. People just don't visit it.
Would it be salvageable as far as the cargo is concerned?
Some of the cargo probably could be salvaged in that lower level. But again, you would probably have to rip the ship apart to get at it.
In the museum on Belle Isle, what is it the name of it?
Dawson's?
Dawson, don't they have a wheel of a ship there? Or a bell? Maybe it's a bell that they had brought up.
Yeah, from the Morel, maybe, or yeah, they have some stuff there.
How did they get it up?
The bell from the Edmund Fitzgerald was raised and brought to Whitefish Point with the families giving their blessing about it. And the state, allegedly, you can salvage things or get a salvage permit to bring things up. But I don't want to, I'm a history guy, I'm kind of a history nut. That the actual stuff doesn't matter to me as much as recording the history. So we'll see what happens in the future with bringing some of that stuff up.
Yeah, so this is a graveyard for the lumberjacks. Have those families been contacted?
No, the great, how would it be? Well, if they were 25 in 1854, they're probably great grandchildren have died of old age. You think about.
There's no line to contact.
And very obscure names. Just the press articles gave names, and some of these guys you didn't know. I'm sure a couple of them didn't even speak English. They were just Smith from somewhere. So it was tracking down those names through the historic record. I mean, it was an obscure shipwreck in an obscure area. So no, I haven't found any of the victims' families or anything. And it probably ended they were probably young enough that it ended their family lines right there. Any other questions?
What's the long-term impact of the mussels? Are they just continuing to expand their little collection?
They cover the bottom of Lake Michigan. If you get off the wreck and look, there's a coating like this, or like puddles of them out there. So it's changed. The lake has changed forever. At Pyramid Point, a place I hike, there'll be mussel shells this high, this wide, for 200 feet. You just crunch on them. My grandchildren will probably be walking on white beaches up there because all that will get beaten down like into powder. Yeah, it affects the gobies. Fish, too, are another invasive species that they just make these dead spots up there where they eat all the oxygen out of the water and just nothing can live. So it's going to impact fishing, the temperature of the water, the temperature of the lakes. The lakes now stay warmer because the sunlight can get down deeper. So there's a lot of different things that are affected. The weather. I mean, it's here to stay, and we just don't know what's going to happen next.
How long were you down there on your first day?
12 minutes. It was pretty scary because when I got back, I'm busy filming, I'm all excited, right? Well, I look at my gas mix and it's like 2/3 of it's gone, and I'm halfway through my dive, and I'm like, I'm not a mathematician, but it's not good. So I was scared. I was like, oh my God, I got to get out of here, So I hightailed it back.
Questions. First of all, like you said, you wouldn't attempt to go down below, and like I was saying, some of the stuff is already. Now, just the very fact that it's been in, even though it's cold water, like you say, that is somewhat of a preservative on the wood. If you did, all right, for instance, when you were walking through there with your camera, if you touched any of the wood accidentally, did it fall, because it was so rotted?
I'll tell you,
And the second question is, you didn't show, I would have liked to have seen the whole diving outfit. You went down and you said you were limited on how much time you were.
yes.
Because if you say the water has a steady temperature, just like the earth does, below the frost line, and it always stays in the 50s. So that's what I was interested in. Is that one picture?
Yeah, okay, the wood. Most of the structure on the Westmoreland is white oak, very thick white oak timber, which is very resilient. Now, some of the spots you see where the wood was missing, they would use pine, cedar, whatever they had around there, throw it up there, and slap a coat of paint on it, you would never know. I went up to the side once and put my hand and went right through like wet cardboard.
That's what I was thinking.
On the white oak is strong. White oak is just like it went down. The rest of the wood is rotted away. The upper cabins were made out of that light wood, and that just turns into, it's about like wet cardboard, so.
They're thinking, the people here are thinking that if you went down there, everything's going to stay whole. I'm thinking.
It deteriorates.
You go through that hole, everything's gonna go clunk more so.
Oh.
Sitting.
Well, it was a very dark dive, and I was down there looking in the hole, and I backed up, and I carry a tank up front here. Let me see if I can get this to work so you can see kind of the setup. And a piece of wood. Okay, so I have a tank here in front too, two big ones on the back. They're 120 pounds on the back. And then this, a snowmobile suit under a dry suit. Yeah, 3 different regulators, all this junk. But what's really cool is it's probably 160 pounds on land, and I'm weightless underwater like an astronaut. So this was hanging down, and a board slid between it, and so I was pinned. And you're covered from, you can't see or feel it, and it's dark, and it's silted out. And I was able to feel it and back out of it, but that's just one of the dangers. That wood laying around all over, it can hook you on stuff. I mean, it's very dangerous. So, no comment. So, this, we,
What did she ask?
if I had a dive buddy, unfortunately, we do a lot of solo diving, though my wife is cracking down on that. So, no, at that time, or a lot of times we'll be at different parts of the ship, and that's why you got to have an extra body. You got to know whatever comes up, you got to be able to get back up to the upline and get out of there. But yeah, heavy duty gear. Usually I'm sweating so much when I put the stuff on that I'm actually glad to get down to the cold water because I'm almost overheating. So, any other questions? Yeah, looks like an oil. There's an actual line, the thermal line. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.